All these points in the view, so we will discuss upon the how to select a rail gauges for any particular construction of the any particular track section connecting the two different points. So some of the factors which will govern the choice of the different gauges includes the first one is the cost of construction, volume and the nature of traffic, development of the area, physical features of the country, and the speed of the movement. So we'll look into that how it will affect the selection of the different type of the railway gauges. The first one we have is the cost of construction. So now whenever you change the any rail gauges, so the cost of construction will increase only marginally, okay, if the wider gauges are adopted. So but the cost of building bridges, culverts, tunneling, etc. will also marginally. So whatever may be irrespective of the type of the rail gauges you select. So when you take the alignment on particular section, wherever the tunnel has to be constructed, bridge has to be constructed, there is no option. You have to go for the construction of such the various components that is essential for you. So the cost of construction will not increase very much whenever you change the rail section, but the cost of land acquisition will be proportionally increased with the wider gauge. So if you want to go for the wider gauge, we need to adopt the acquire the more land. That will increase the cost of land acquisition, and also the earthwork, the number of sleepers you require, number of the ballast, how much the ballast filling you need to fill, and that will all increases along with the when you go for the choose the wider gauges. And also the cost of construction of the buildings like platforms, railway stations, staff quarters, level crossing signals, etc. So this is like same for all, irrespective of what is the type of the gauge you select. You need to provide all such facility for each and every type of the track section. So the cost of construction of such station buildings will not change along with the wider gauges, choosing the wider gauges. And also the cost of the when it comes to the cost of rolling stock. Rolling stocks is nothing but the running parts, maybe the locomotives, the engines what we use. So that will also be remain same for all type of the gauges. But only thing cost what is just changing is the what is the cost of land acquisition and the cost of width, cost of the various components, maybe the sleepers. So that will consider as proportionally increase when you choose for the wider tracks. The next consideration when you select for these the rail gauge required is the volume and the nature of traffic. Obviously, greater the traffic volume, the greater will be the load carrying capacity. Thus, it is possible for you to carry the heavier loads, and the high speed can be achieved. That's why whenever you have the high traffic volume, it should be choose for the wider gauges. So maybe the broad gauge has to be used. And as well as the operating cost per ton kilometer is also less for higher load carrying capacity. The next one is the development of the area. So as we already discussed, where we have to choose the different types of the railway gauges. So in those regions where the prosperity of development in future is high, and also where there is a more industrial and commerce development, so we can go for the usage of the wider tracks. And the narrow gauges will be used only in those regions which are likely to develop and which are thinly populated area. So especially and in the underdeveloped area with the or in the urbanized area, so we can go for the use of the narrow gauges. And the next one is the physical features of the country. So wherever there is a restriction to the width, especially when you have the hill stations or very the sharp curves are expected, you can go for the choose of the narrow gauges. And the broad gauges will be in all other regions where in the plain terrain you will go for the construction of the broad gauges. And the last one is the speed of the movement. So if the higher speed need to be achieved, so speed and the gauge width are proportional to each other. Greater the gauge width, the higher speed can be achieved. And lower speed, always see whenever the lower speed is provided, it will discourages the passengers. So hence it is always you should intend and to maintain the broader gauge, so that higher speed can be achieved and it will attract the passenger. So these are some of the points you need to keep it in mind when you go for the selection of the any particular type of the railway gauges. The next topic we have related to the uniformity of the rail gauges. So now what is this uniformity of rail gauges and what is the requirement of the providing the uniformity in the rail gauges? So nothing but in India we have different track section which is connecting between the different part. So now uniformity has come to picture, nothing but providing the same gauge width throughout the entire country. Means whatever the track you construct in India, so you must be constructed only with the help of the broad gauge or the standard gauge. So you need to maintain the equal width on the entire section of the track within the throughout the country. And what is the requirement, why we have to maintain the uniform gauge? So now we'll first look into that, what are all the difficulties that may we come across if we have the different rail gauges. So now first thing is whenever your track section changes from broad gauge to meter gauge, so now rolling stock whatever you use here, the same train cannot be used in the broad meter gauge section because there is a width differences. So what is the distance between the two axles, the wheels on the axles, that will changes here on the different railway sections. So where a different train has to move on these two sections. Now whenever the rail train section changes from broad gauges to meter gauge, what are all the difficulties that will come across to you? So now the passengers and the goods what we have in this train need to be transferred to the gauge with the smaller gauges. So now there will be a delay can be expected while transferring the delay cost as well as the time will increases while transshipping the passengers as well as the goods from one vehicle of one gauge to the other vehicle. So if you provide a uniform gauge, that delay can be avoided. And also this during the transshipping there are chances of breakage of the goods. That breakage can be eliminated if you provide a uniform gauge. And also the difficulty during the loading and unloading of the goods can be avoided, and the labor expenses what it is required for you, that can also be saved. And also while transferring the goods from one train to another train, there is chances of misplacement and the theft can happen, so that can be completely eliminated. And while transferring, maybe it cannot happen over a night, so we may have to store your goods in the larger sheds. So if you construct a uniform gauges, the construction of that larger sheds wherever at the place of transferring the goods from one vehicle to other vehicle, that is not required. So I mean to say that whenever there is a change in this section from meter gauge to one gauge to the other gauge, so here you may have to construct the additional railway station, the additional larger shed. So now to avoid all these difficulties, it is required for us to maintain the uniformity of the rail gauges. So whenever there is an acute requirement, provide the narrow gauges. Okay, there is not at all possible to provide the uniform gauges. Yes, in such cases you can deviate it, but wherever it is possible, make sure that your rail gauge will be uniform. And next, the locomotives can be effectively used on all type of the gauges. If you have one single track section or width, so entire with respective of region, you can use whatever the locomotives that are available that can be used on the entire track section. And also the duplication of equipments or such as the platform sanitary arrangements, so that is not required for the storage of goods. The platforms may be required and the sanitary arrangements, so that duplication is eliminated and you can avoid it, and it will save the lot of extra expenditures. And also during the military movement, so which is of greater importance, so there will not be any time wasted in changing the person and the war equipments from one vehicle to the another vehicle when you provide the uniform gauges. And also coming to the quite expensive, so when it is when you want to change from meter gauge to the broad gauges in the future, if you want to increase the gauge weight, so that the cost which is required for you is very expensive. So as in case of the roads, you cannot just keep on adding one lane next to each other. Okay, so entire track section has to be constructed newly, so that the cost of upgrading to the higher gauge width is very expensive in the future stages. And also the construction of the fresh widening of the bridges and channels, that will also be very costly for you in the entire So these are all about the gauges, what are the different types and the requirement, and as well as the what is the requirement of choosing the uniformity of the gauges section to the countries. So next component what we have is the rails. Okay, that's the second component. The first what we discussed was the gauges. The second component in a permanent way is the rails. So now what are the rails? So rails are nothing but considered as a steel girders, so which is purpose is to carry your axle load. So your wheels will be carried on these steel girders, and ultimately this is the one which will in contact with the wheel, and that will take the axle loads. And so that's why it should be constructed with the manufactured with the help of the high quality high carbon steel, so that it should withstand the wear and tear, since it is in direct contact with the moving loads which is moving at a very high speed. So there are chances that your rail section gets wear. Okay, so you should have it should be made up of manufactured with the proper material, so that it can consider withstand the wear and tear. So usually we will choose high carbon steel with the following proposition. The carbon content should be in between 0.6 to 0.8 percentage, manganese 0.8 to 1.5, silicon and sulfur, phosphorus, and aluminium. So we have the proper proportion is prescribed, and whenever you manufacture the rail section, this proportion has to be keep it in mind, so that you can have the higher capacity, and there will be a resistance to the wear and tear of the section. So next we'll look into the what are all the various functions that is served by the rail section. So now the rails will provided to provide a hard, smooth, and unchanging surface for the passage of the heavy moving load, so with the maximum friction between the steel rails and the steel wheels. And also, since it is in direct contact with the axle loads are transmitted on the rail sections, so that should have sufficient bear the sufficient stress that is developed because of the heavy loads, and also the lateral, and also it should withstand the stresses developed because of the braking force, and also the thermal expansion in the construction that will occur because of the change in temperature of the rail section. And also the material used in the rail section should give the minimum wear. So because whenever the rail section wears, you need to completely replace it. Okay, so if the rail section what we use is having a resistance to the wear, so you can avoid the replacement charges and the failures of the rails due to the wear. And also it should have a capability to transfer the loads to the sleepers, and it will consequently reduces the pressure on the formation and the ballast below the rail section. These are the major functions served by the rail sections. Rails. So now here the picture here will shows you the what are all the various rail fittings that can be used. So here picture here indicates the various rail fastening which is used to connect your rail with the sleeper. So you can see here there's a rail section. The rail is divided into head, web, and the foot section. The sleeper, so the rails are connected to the sleeper with the help of you can see here we have the chair bolts with the chair keys are provided. And also the one rail section is connected with the other rail section with the help of the fish plate and the fish bolts. So anyways, we'll be discussing in details about the rail fittings in the coming classes. So with this I will conclude the today's session, and the tomorrow's class will continue the discussion with the rails. Thank you.